not only economically and financially, but also in terms of the rule of law and on Ukraine and the sanctions. So it is beyond dispute that this election has a strong relevance for the future of the European Union. For this reason, I'm very grateful to Eric Jones, Director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, who has initiated this seminar idea and organized it. And I would like to hand over to him, hoping that many of you will in the future also attend our regular seminar series. Thank you. Eric.
Thank you so much, Daniele. I just want to say very quickly that this seminar is actually provided in cooperation with the Conference Group on Italian Politics and Society of the American Political Science Association, and the Società Italiana di Scienza Politica, and the Loop, which is the official blog of the European Consortium for Political Research. And it builds out of a partnership that we're forging at the Robert Schuman Center with the Istituto Cattaneo, because we believe that the study of Italian politics is something that is important, not just because we live in Italy, but because of the world-shaping nature of what's going on in the Italian political system today. Having said that, this is not the first time we've thought that. A lot of the people in this room and on this call are old alumni of the EUI. And so what I'm going to do is hand over to Marco D'Albruzzi, who's going to be our master of ceremonies for the show. He'll introduce the panelists and take over from there. I want to thank everyone for being on the show and look forward to the conversation that will follow. Marco, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Daniele. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having asked me to be the moderator of this discussion, of this roundtable. It's always nice for me to be back, to return at the UI. I was a former PhD researcher at the UI, so it's happy to be back at my alma mater. It's not easy for me to be a moderator when the radicals win, especially when the radicals win. This is what happened in the last Italian parliamentary election. The Giorgia Meloni's party, Brothers of Italy, won big the parliamentary election, but I'll try to do my best to be moderate, to be a good moderator, so to speak. We have a great, wonderful lineup of scholars, experts in Italian politics, and not only in Italian politics, in Western European politics in general. Let me just introduce our four speakers of today. We have, let me start in alphabetical order. We have Filia Hellum, is professor of Italian politics at the University of Bath. Filia's research interests include Western European politics, Italian politics, European Union politics, organized crimes, and I should add also organized crime, especially in southern regions of Italy. Then we have Catherine Fieschi. She's a comparative analyst and director of Counterpoint, a think tank that focuses on mobilization, protest, and dissent. She's an expert on contemporary forms of populism in Europe and the author of Populocracy. She's also a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the UI. Then we have Sylvia Merler. We have a political economist among our speakers, our panelists. Sylvia Merler is head of ESG and policy research at Algebris Investment, an independent global asset manager. Before that, Sylvia was affiliate fellow at the Bruegel. She held a bachelor degree and a master degree in economics from Bocconi University and a PhD in European and Euro-Asian studies from Johns Hopkins University in Bologna. Davide Bampa, last but not least, is a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. He has published extensively on regional politics and public policy, populism, comparative political economy, social democracy in Western Europe and beyond. His latest book, written with Daniele Albertazzi, is Populism in Europe, Lessons from Umberto Bossi, Northern League. There are many lessons that we should learn from this election, not only from the past election when Umberto Bossi was the leader of the league. Let me just introduce the topic, and then I will leave the floor to our speaker. The panel is organized, the round table is organized as follows, more or less. We will have a first round of comment, of discussion and conversation on the implication of the Italian general election on domestic politics. I would like to have the interpretation. I will ask our speaker to give us their interpretation of the election result, the winner and the loser of the election, and also an overall interpretation of the Italian election. In the few days ago, many scholars said that we have observed a historic critical election. Indeed, this election has set many records. The lowest level of turnout, 64% since the foundation of the Italian Republic. Brothers of Italy won 26% of the vote, the largest vote share for a radical right party in Western Europe. The center-left or the left-wing political parties scored a record low level of electoral support. We will probably have a new government dominated by far-right, radical right, Eurosceptic, sovereignist parties, and also probably we will have the first female prime minister. So we have many things to discuss in the first round of discussion. Then we will move on in the second round of discussion. We would like to focus on the consequences of this election on the relationship between Italy and the European Union, as Eric and Daniele have already anticipated. We would like to know if there will be any change in the relationship between Italy and Italy with the new Eurosceptic, sovereignist, probably neo-nationalistic government led by Giorgia Meloni and the European institution. But at the same time, we would like to know also if there will be any change in the strategic position of Italy at the international level. Until now, the position of the Italian government was clear enough, in favor of the pro-NATO alliance, in favor of the sanction against Russia, in favor of the position of Ukraine. The new government and the party included in the new government, we know they have different position on these issues, and it is interesting for us to discuss these issues, this topic in relationship to the new equilibria that we can observe at the European supranational level. I also have to add that we will, at the end of this two round of discussion, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. You can write your question, your comment using Zoom. There is a button at the bottom of the software of Zoom to include your question or comment. There is also the possibility to upvote the best questions. So the audience can also grade or vote the best question, and we can read the question using this ranking produced by the audience. I said what I had to say. Without further ado, let me pass the ball. Let me hand over to the first speaker, again in alphabetical order. Filia Hellum. Filia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco, for this very clear overview and proceedings and order of proceedings. I'd like to first of all thank the organisers for inviting me. I hope that I will be able to add to the debate, although this isn't an area that I'm directly researching in this particular moment in time. Obviously, I have come across and I have spent a lot of time thinking about some of these issues. I only have 8 minutes to talk, so what I'd like to do is just to, offer some reflections and some observations of what we've seen, potentially relating to the bigger picture of domestic policies and how Italian politics is going to develop in the next few days, in the next few months, although I have no way of necessarily foreseeing. So the first point I'd like to make is I think history is important. I think that we have to look at what is happening in Italy from in a historical context. We can't look at what's happening in Italy just as in a vacuum. I think that we have to look at Italy's journey throughout the post-war period to understand and to have a look at the deeply unresolved conflicts that exist within Italian society, within the political system as it has developed in the post-war period, the electoral system, the institutions that work together. Coming to mind is the expression that Joseph La Palombara has used often to talk about Italian politics, is the idea of democracy Italian style, that, you know, in Italy there was a specific form of democracy that developed, and we had to look at the democracy and question what democracy was within the Italian context. And we've also talked about bloc democracy for a very long time. Obviously, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the whole of the equilibrium in Western Europe, and in particular the equilibrium as it played out in Italy, changed, and we've been seeing how that has developed over the last 20 years. In 1994, we had Berlusconi. He came to power after the change of the electoral system, and we have been seeing what's been going on since. So the context, the historical context, I think must not be forgotten. I have a couple of points that I just want to briefly make. First of all, I think a lot of West European commentators have been surprised and shocked of the result and the increased vote that the Fratelli d'Italia have gained, from being at 4 or 5% in 2018 to getting 26%, which is obviously a huge increase. But again, perhaps not necessarily that extensive, if you want. If we look at what happened to the Five Star Movement, the same kind of increase they had, if you want, from 2013, from 0 in 2008 and 2009 when they didn't exist. So I think that, you know, we have to sort of look at it, as I said, within a kind of context. West European actors or commentators have been shocked, but I think those of us looking closer weren't necessarily shocked. And it reminded me very much of a song that I listened to often when I was learning Italian back in the mid-80s by Riccardo Cocciante, which was, you know, era già tutto previsto, everything there was, or it was all already clear. I don't know, my translation's not very good, but it was a foregone conclusion. In other words, if we look closely 2 or 3 months ago at the electoral system, and the electoral context of what was going on in Italy, we hadn't, I mean, I don't think it came as a surprise on Sunday who actually won, because it was all very clear and it was all pre-announced. What I mean by that is that the electoral system obviously was going to favour those who went into some kind of political alliance, political coalition before the election. So clearly there was one side that did that and the other one didn't, and therefore I don't think we were very, very surprised. Now, how the electoral system was developed back in 2017, who decided it should be like this, it is interesting in itself. It's not pure PR as the previous system, but it's also not a pure first past the post system. It has a kind of strange dynamic, which then gives some really kind of interesting and odd results, where you've got some members or some parties that only have, again, a small percentage of the vote, but have a huge number of MPs when we have a look at it. So I was just thinking of Renzi, who has 10 members when he has still a relatively small percentage of the vote. So again, the electoral system actually kind of was already telling us what was going on if we had a clear look at that. Another aspect of the electoral system, which I think is important, is how we also see parachuted candidates, how the political parties, although we can talk about them being in crisis and there needs to be a renewal of ideological debate, the political parties still were the ones who were deciding who was put on the list. And when we think that there are some candidates in Sicily who were elected and who've not actually have any relationship with Sicily, we can still see that the political parties have some kind of influence, have some kind of power. So first of all, the electoral system. Secondly, I'd like to make a comment about the electoral campaign. You know, it's a very unique electoral campaign that took place during the summer. It was a snap election during the summertime, which meant that there wasn't actually very much debate. There weren't really a debate of ideas. There was kind of clearly the politicians at the beginning of the summer saying, we're not going to go and campaign on the beach. We're not really going to talk to people because we don't want to bother people, which means that actually there's been a vacuum of political ideas and political debates. And because it was clear who more or less was ahead, in actual fact, some people didn't really talk because by talking they might have lost support. So the electoral campaign, the use of social media, the use of TikTok by politicians was a new era, if we want, and a new domain. And I think the timing was really important, because if this election had been held, let's say, after the winter, perhaps the dynamics would have been very, very different. Perhaps the electorate would have been more fed up or more disenfranchised than before. The third point I want to make is we talked about the losers and the winners. I think more generally for me, it's about the ideologies and the debates. We can clearly see that I would argue that the left is in difficulty, but then I would argue that the PD has been in difficulty, or the left wing space has been in difficulty since the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm not sure we can call the PD necessarily European left, but more a kind of social democrat space. And I think that there has to be a renewal of ideas. And I think that whereas perhaps the right, extreme right, were clearer in their ideas of what they meant, I think that the left is really not necessarily in crisis, but has a lot of questions to ask itself in order to propose an agenda that is appealing, or at least makes sense to its electorate. Because it was a fragmented opposition, it meant that there wasn't really some real new ideas. And I don't think this applies only to Italy. I think we can see that across Western Europe, where the left has to really think about whether it wants to be social democrat or it wants to be more socialist in its thinking. Another point that I wanted to make, obviously, is one that's been made across the Italian media, is the movement. You know, the right didn't actually, the extreme right didn't increase its vote. It was just that there was a movement between the Northern League and the extreme right. And therefore, you know, to sort of say, oh, the right has gained a huge amount of percentage of votes, that's actually not really true. It's the same amount of votes, but there's been a movement between one and the other. So we can't necessarily exaggerate that all of a sudden we've either had a movement from the left to the right, or we've had a new movement in the right towards the right, because that's not actually the case. What we can then go and have a look, which might be interesting, is who voted for who. So we can see that, for example, the Five Star Movement has clearly become a party of the South, whereas the Fratelli d'Italia has become a national party, much more gaining votes in the north and in the south. And those dynamics are interesting to have a look at. And again, we can discuss them further. Three last points very quickly. As Marco mentioned, I think we're not talking enough about turnout and the abstentionism that's taken place. And nobody's really talked about perhaps how that might actually be a protest vote, because people might have decided that there was really no alternative that they identified with. There was no political party or political space that they identified with, and therefore they decided not to vote. And I must admit, in my kind of friends and communities and networks, there were a lot of people who did actually decide not to go and vote because they felt that there was nothing there for them. And I think that that hasn't really been addressed to a great extent. Probably doesn't necessarily need to be, but some political parties might have to ask, as I said before, questions around what they're offering. Two other quick points and then I'll stop. I've been looking at the Italian papers, and what I found really interesting was the fact that the church has had to take a voice. The church has had to sort of make comments about, you know, where society was in reaction perhaps to the fear that, you know, Western European onlookers and observers are making comments about where Italy can go with this new extreme right-wing government. And it's been interesting that the church has had to feel that it needs to present itself to sort of say, we're here and we're going to keep everything in a very calm way. Two last points. I know I said one, but I just want to make a last point about policies and about the rhetoric that we see during an election campaign, and whether that actually then becomes hard policies and implementable policies. We know that the right-wing coalition talks about the tyranny of Brussels, and I know we'll talk about it later, but how they managed to transform their rhetoric, their hard rhetoric, for example, the anti-women agenda, the nationalist agenda, the anti-immigration agenda, and how they actually are able to transform that into hard policies will be interesting. I always find that there is a disconnect between some of the things that are said during electoral campaigns and then what is possible in government, and also what is institutionally possible in terms of the actual constraints. I know that we have experiences of other political parties that once they actually get into government, they can't actually do very much. And it'll be interesting to see what happens here. I know a lot of people have already predicted that, you know, the coalition isn't going to last very long, it's going to fall, etc. But it'll be interesting to see this rhetoric during the election campaign and, you know, if we can see if the government lasts 5 years, what they actually managed to do, not only in terms of their ambition, but also the constraints of the institutions. And one last point, I suppose I would make, and then I'll stop if that's okay, and I hope I haven't spoken too long, Marco, is that what we saw happen in the French presidential elections, one could argue, was a rehearsal of what we're seeing in Italy. In France, there was a clear Republican bloc. There was a clear Republican front that was able to block the so-called threat of Jean-Marie Le Pen, of Marine Le Pen. And I would argue that, you know, what I can see, or how I interpret a lot of the things that are going on in Western Europe, in France, but also in Italy, is very much Western political systems that are in crisis. We're in a situation of crisis where there are not a lack of renewal of ideas, and therefore people who are either abstaining because they don't want to participate, or trying to participate, but the system not necessarily helping in terms of translating their voices into concrete votes. So I'm not gloom and doom, but I think that the situation is an interesting one for observers on the outside. I think history is important. We've got to take it within a historical context, but I think that we've got a lot to sort of learn and see how we move forward. I hope that's of interest, and I've said some things that might stimulate some kind of questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Filia. Thank you also for giving us the historical perspective of this election. I hand over quickly and directly to Catherine.
Hi, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to participate just a few days after this momentous result. So I will try and follow in Filia's footsteps and offer some reflections, because actually at this moment it's all that we can do. I think, you know, prediction is a fool's game at this point. So I think I'll give just what my hunch is that we are seeing and that we may be looking at in the next few weeks and few months. The first point I guess I want to make, and you know, it connects to something I found surprising over the past few days, and to something Filia said, which is that, yes, there's been a lot of shocked comment, and there's been some headlines. I mean, the headline, for example, in Le Monde was that, you know, the extreme right had just achieved power in Italy. Very straightforward headlines, really naming a spade a spade. But what was also very interesting was the fact that there was not much of a market reaction to what happened in Italy. There was no earthquake, you know, no market earthquake after this. And this, I thought, was interesting, because, you know, it points directly to one of the issues around this result, which is, you know, the fact that Meloni is very difficult to decipher as a politician, because she has that historical trajectory with which we are familiar. But at the same time, she seems to have quietly already convinced a number of actors that she's not terribly dangerous for stability. And I think that this is really quite interesting. It goes to the heart of the question that I think that many are asking in the aftermath of this election, which is that basically, are we seeing more of the same with respect to Italy? There's one way to read this election, which is that this is more volatility, and more to the point, that this is protest voting. And as Filia pointed out, you know, the fact is that the voters of the Lega defected to the Brothers of Italy. We've got, therefore, Brothers of Italy in the north, and we've got the Five Star Movement in the south. And this, you know, in some ways paints a picture of an electorate that is divided, but that is divided potentially, you know, between non-mainstream and potentially protest options. I think actually it's worth saying a little bit more about that, because one of the things that I do think we need to keep in mind is how this election came about. And how this election came about, I think, answers some of the questions as to low turnout and abstention. Just like it might explain also the high score of Meloni. Meloni was the only one who wasn't part of the coalition around Draghi. She stayed well out of power, and I think that that this was something that for many voters, the fact that she was untainted by cooperation with a relatively technocratic and very pro-European government was something that appealed to them. It's also really interesting that if we look at the Five-Star Movement, they account for a lot of the abstention. 1/3 of Five-Star Movement voters from 2018 didn't bother to turn out. Now, whether this was because they were disinclined to reward Conte, who's kind of in part blamed for bringing down the Draghi government, or whether they're completely fed up, is something that we need to find out through more research. But it is, I think, important to look at this vote in this historical trajectory, with the fact that we have seen quite a lot of turnover from one party to the next, and ask ourselves what this means now for Italy in terms of its electorate. Are we going to see, for example, a real decline of the Lega? Is Brothers of Italy really going to step in and replace them? The Five-Star Movement was almost given as dead, but in fact, what we saw in these last elections is that actually there was a resurgence, and to some extent, there is a question there that we need to ask about whether they are slowly starting to replace, the left options in Italy, the traditional left options in Italy. So these are completely open questions. And I think the second important point to make is that many commentators and analysts that I've spoken to before the election and since the election, they've picked up on this sense that Meloni is a slightly different character here. They've picked up on the fact that even though she's obviously personally ambitious and that, she has used the social media tricks, to her own advantage in the campaign, they detect in her something different. No one is quite sure how to label her, whether she should be labeled fascist, a neo-fascist, a post-fascist, a nationalist conservative. But the fact is that they detect in her something which is very different from the kind of right-wing populism that we've seen at play in Italy over the past 20 years, or even 25 years. And that is that she seems to be concerned with playing a long game. She seems to be concerned about coming across as extremely competent. We see much less of the desire to upset, if you like, the order very, very brutally, which is, I think, in part, what the markets, possibly in their lack of wisdom, are reading. And so I think the question, and what we might be about to see, is essentially a game of two halves. I think that, Meloni wants time on her side. She will try and stabilize this coalition as much as she can. And in order to do that, I think that she knows that she has a hard winter ahead of her, an energy crisis ahead of her. She wants to maintain her relationship, of course, her Atlanticism, and her relationship with NATO. But she will find herself, and she finds herself in a situation where she does need the 200 billion from the European Union. So my sense is that she won't go easy in the European arena, but that she knows that she needs to go gently. She needs to get through the next few months. And so while I think that we may see a rather rational, competent, non-bombastic, if you like, prime minister in Italy from the European point of view to begin with, I don't think that this will last, but we can talk about this in the second half. I think that, probably her strategy will be to make good on her campaign promises as much as she can from a social and domestic perspective, to protect Italians, to protect Italian voters. It was quite clear from her victory speech, her attempt to move beyond her party base and to govern in the name of all Italians. I think we're going to see quite a traditional protectionist prime minister at work here, but also quite a traditional nationalist conservative. And I think she'll be able to do this for a few months. And then, we may see a much more difficult chapter open up for Europe. I'll end on this. Filia said that, France may have been a rehearsal for Italy. I think that, Italy has been a rehearsal for France for a long time, and that it, possibly works the other way around just as strongly, if not more strongly. And I think that, when we talk about Europe, this is where we need to worry, 6 months, 1 year down the line. She will keep her coalition going as much as she can. She has the votes to do it. She's worth three times her coalition partners in electoral terms. So in some ways, I think, she has her sights on longevity. She has her sights on stability. And at the very least, to begin with, this is what she's going to privilege. And then we're going to run into trouble at the European level.
Thank you, Catherine. Really interesting, your comment, your position on the result of this election. You said that there was no market earthquake after the result of when we read the result of this election. I will pass the same comment about the reaction of the market, of the economic system, to Silvia Merler. I would like to know if she had the same impression, and if this reaction or no reaction of the market, of the economic system will last, and how long will it last? So, Silvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and also thank you to Philly and Catherine for this really interesting and very exhaustive remarks. It's difficult to add anything to all what you said. So before I get to the markets, I actually wanted to pick up on something that Catherine said at the very end. So was Italy a rehearsal for France, or the other way around? Because I think one of the most interesting thing is Italy has been a political experiment for quite some time now, and 2018 was really possibly the weirdest political experiment that one might expect, because the result of the 2018 election was a coalition government of two populist parties, an exclusionary populist and an inclusionary populist party, which seemed impossible, I think, before it actually happened. 5 years in, and those parties were both not performing very well in the elections. So both 5-star, and more surprisingly, I think, especially compared to the polls going into the election, Lega, were both hurt by their government experience. And so the response, however, was not a return to some sort of more mainstream politics, but the choice for a third way of populism, so to speak, which is now openly right-wing, and something that perhaps we can frame more easily in a left-right sort of cleavage context, but again, still very populist. And so moving even further to the extreme, which I think was interesting in terms of the result. I think there were not many surprises. Most of it, the result was anticipated, and this, I think, is part of the reason why markets have not reacted in a bad way. This was priced in, as we say in jargon. Yet, I think there were a few things that were a little bit surprising. So one obviously was the historically record low turnout. And then if you look at where turnout was the lowest, I think that is concerning for the long term, because turnout was especially low in areas that are more peripheral, that have lower income levels, that have lower levels of educational attainment, higher unemployment, so more difficult socioeconomic conditions. And so That to me sort of suggests that, let's say, those who would need politics the most, those who would need to use voice the most, have lost faith in the political process entirely. And to some extent that goes to the detriment of 5 Star, because a lot of that vote had been 5 Star votes. So 5 Star is the party that has suffered the most outflows towards abstentionism rather than towards other parties. And I think that's very interesting to see. The second point I think that's important to keep in mind is there are 2 parties that are facing clearly an existential identitarian crisis. One of this is the center-left, one is PD mostly, because PD is basically what happens when you try to get the popular vote by talking to the elites. And I think that's been very, very clear for some time, and it really played out in this election. And I think now it's extremely clear. If you look at the demographics of PD voters, the only demographics where they got more votes than average population is among people who are retired. So they didn't poll very well among the young. They didn't poll very well among people who feel they are experiencing economic hardships. So the classic constituency of the left just didn't vote for them. Middle class and relatively older voter did. So clearly they're facing sort of a soul-searching time. The other party that's facing big soul-searching is obviously Lega, because Lega is what happened when you try to keep the protest vote, 2018 protest vote, but still being in government. And I think that that was the reason why eventually the result was worse than it was polled going into the election. The third point that I would make that I thought was interesting is the only 2 parties that did slightly better than they were polled going into the elections were 5 Star marginally, but and Brothers of Italy. So the 2 parties that were either out of the Draghi government, as Catherine was saying for Brothers of Italy, or that contributed actively to the end of that government, which was triggered by 5 Star and the role on several legislative initiatives going into the summer, so around July. And I think that's also interesting, because if you look at polls and opinion surveys on the Draghi government, what you constantly see is this very high level of trust in the figure of the prime minister himself and in the government. But at the same time, what you have is then going into general elections, voters are rewarding parties that were either not part of that government or that actually contributed to that government early demise. And so also very interesting for what I think might be then the attitude towards technocracy on one end, and then European technocracy even more. All this brings us to your question, Marco. So why were markets not spooked by this election? I think the reason is largely that Meloni has been very clever in her positioning. She's been effectively pursuing 2 parallel and different narratives. So one is the domestic narrative towards her core electorate, and we see that it's been obviously building up over several years. It's an identitarian, nationalistic, populistic kind of discourse, but the discourse that she had for foreigners, for markets, was completely different. It was a discourse around responsibility, around wanting to become an institutionalized player, around wanting to keep continuity with many of Draghi's and the Draghi government's policies, first and foremost, the implementation of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. And so I think in that respect, this is the reason why we didn't see that negative market reactions that many might have anticipated would come out of the result, because first of all, the result was anticipated, and second, that result was read in a positive light following this very, very clever, I think, operation of responsabilization that Meloni did about herself with respect to that particular audience. The third reason why I think it was welcomed, so to speak, from a financial standpoint, is that also within the coalition, the balance of power is imbalanced, is really imbalanced. So one of the risks, I think, going into this election from the perspective of financial markets and market players observers was, first of all, the 2/3 majority scenario that would have obviously been welcomed in a very different way, I think. But then the second risk was to end up having a center-right coalition where you had almost equal powers. And that was a risk because in that case, the potential struggles, internal struggles for power might have been a lot stronger than what they might be in this situation where one party is clearly a senior partner and the other parties are clearly junior partners. And so I think this is the third reason why the result was welcomed relatively positively, because it sort of increases the odds that there's going to be stability rather than instability within the coalition. Then obviously we'll see, and the period going up to nomination, when the ministers will need to be decided and positions will need to be allocated, is obviously going to be the moment where this assumption is going to be proven right or wrong. So we'll see.
Thank you, Silvia. Davide, it's your turn. Let me also add a personal, specific question. Should we be worried about the rise of the far right, extreme right, radical right party, Brothers of Italy in this case, in Italy, or is just business as usual? It's we have a very volatile electorate. This turn is the turn of the far right. Next time probably will be the turn of another party, probably a different ideological party. So we shouldn't be worried about the result of this election. Davide, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thanks also for the invitation. And I will get to your question towards the end of my intervention. And I mean, I should start by saying that the winner of the election was Giorgia Meloni with her party, Brothers of Italy, but the speakers who preceded me have already mentioned that in their excellent presentation. So I'll try to add a few points. I would say that the right overall won, but as also the speakers who preceded me said, Meloni's victory came at the expense of its right-wing allies and Matteo Salvini in particular. So we all know that Salvini is kind of loser within the winning coalition. He lost badly, I think, not only because the League collapsed. Let's remember that in the 2019 European election, the League won more than 30% of the vote, and after 3 years is at 8%, so a collapse. But Salvini, I think, lost even more because the strategy that he developed over the last 5 to 7 years has completely failed. So the transformation of the Northern League, which was a regionalist party, into the National League led to impressive electoral growth in a very short period of time. But it was built on very weak foundations, as we can see. And while building this National League that grew to unprecedented levels, Salvini forgot the electoral bloc on which the League success and resilience was built and based in the 1990s and 2000s. So Salvini has built a new party that is today ideologically and programmatically very similar to Meloni's, but does not have the same credibility, I think, as Meloni has, given her history, her background. Perhaps Salvini could now try to return to the origins of the League as a party strongly rooted in the North and focused on decentralization. And this could be a way to, let's say, differentiate the League from Brothers of Italy, but I doubt that Salvini would be the right leader for this change. So I'm talking a lot about the others because we have already talked a lot about Meloni, and I'm also talking about Silvio Berlusconi. That we should also mention because almost 30 years after its foundation, Berlusconi's party, Forza Italia, of course, is much weaker than it used to be. But Berlusconi, I think, has shown resilience and great strategic skill by positioning himself as a key player in the construction of a future right-wing government. with 8% of the vote, Berlusconi can still play a role in Italian politics because Giorgia Meloni needs the support of his party to stay in power. And we know that in the Italian context, you can create quite a lot of mess just with one small party. So Berlusconi will still play a role there. Going back to Brothers of Italy, there are many factors that can explain the success of this party. Which is, I think, is surprising that it was particularly strong in central northern Italy, since let's remember that the Italian Social Movement and National Alliance, which were parties in which Meloni started her political career, were strongly rooted in the south. So there has been a geographical shift there. But I think that obviously the electorate's discontent after years of crisis and economic stagnation has rewarded the only political group that has consistently been in opposition. Catherine said during the Draghi government, but actually Brothers of Italy has been in opposition for the last 10 years. And all the other main parties have been in government in various roles during this period. So I think that made a difference. Moreover, Meloni has proved to be an excellent communicator, I think, often underestimated by her opponents. And while remaining in opposition, she has supported the Draghi government in most of its international policy choices. Maybe we'll talk about that later during the Ukraine crisis, and she avoided the criticism of being too pro-Russia, for example, and this criticism was aimed at both Salvini and Berlusconi. But I think generally, ultimately, Meloni's victory was facilitated by the divisions of her opponents on the center left. And so if we move to the left, we are witnessing, and this was already mentioned, yet another crisis for the Democratic Party. And the PD, the Democratic Party, the center-left mainstream party, was unable to create a competitive alternative to the right and to form a broad coalition. In fact, the PD failed to finalize an alliance with the center first, but it also refused to seek an alliance with the Five Star Movement. And personally, I think that an alliance with the Five Star Movement in particular would have at least ensured a more balanced competition with the right, since the Five Star Movement, which has somehow clearly shifted to the left, becoming a more progressive party, eventually managed to achieve good results in the South, as was already mentioned. So this might have changed a bit the result. But anyway, for the first time since 2008, the election seems to have produced a clear result. The center-right coalition won a clear absolute majority of the seats in both houses of parliament. This didn't happen since 2008. The Italian political system is a parliamentary system, and so the appointment of the new prime minister is the responsibility of the president of the republic. So given that the right-wing coalition won an absolute majority of seats and the party of Giorgia Meloni is by far the largest in the coalition, it is likely that the president will ask Meloni to form the new government. So this means, as was already mentioned, that we might have the first female prime minister in Italy. However, I would also add that the process of government formation and its survival is made more complicated by the extreme fragmentation and fluidity of the Italian political system, which was already shaken in the 1990s, but which after the financial crisis, the Great Recession, and all the other crises that have hit Europe over the last decade, has become even more unstable and seems unable to find a new equilibrium. In Italy, political parties have basically become relatively loose groups of political personnel controlled by strong leaders. So often parties are dominated by the personalities of the leaders, and Brothers of Italy, but also Berlusconi's party, Salvini's parties are clear examples of this phenomenon. So they no longer have a solid base, and this explains the constant electoral fluctuations, repositioning that we have been observing for years now. Add to this the fact that the Italian electoral system creates great distortions, and this was explained in the first intervention. So in this very fluid political situation, we cannot predict how long a Meloni government will last, also in a context of international financial turbulence. As I said, Meloni needs the support of both Forza Italia and the Lega for a government to remain in office, and the two allies could create problems for her in future. And to conclude, and maybe I will also answer to your question about whether we should be worried. The effects of this change, I think, of this government might be felt in some economic policies, perhaps in foreign policy, and we will talk about that later. But I think there could be a strongly conservative reorientation of policies which affect the sphere of personal freedoms, civil rights, LGBT rights, abortion. There was a big debate on that as well. And I would also add that the right-wing coalition could attempt to change the institutional setup of Italy by promoting a presidential reform of the political system with the direct election of the president. This is more complicated because the right doesn't have 2/3 majority of seats in parliament. And so any reform of the constitution must be confirmed by a referendum. And in the past, many reforms have been blocked by referendums. But these attempts at reform, I think, may have a major impact on Italian democracy, also given its current state. This election had the lowest turnout ever, and the level of public trust in institutions is at an all-time low. So this might lead to worrying domestic developments in the Italian domestic arena, I think, in future. Thanks.
Many thanks, Davide. Okay, we are running perfectly on time, and we can move to the next, to the higher level, to the upper level, talking about the implication of the result of this election on the supranational, on the European level, and also for the consequence of this election for the position of Italy at the international level. So these are the two issues that I would like to tackle with you. Let me also add two more questions. The first question you mentioned in your talk, in your speech, is the role of Mario Draghi, the technocratic government. Do you think that the existence of a technocratic government can explain the result, some part of the result some part of the election result, for instance, the level of turnout or the success of the far-right parties and so on? So this is the first question that I add to the second round of discussion. And the second and last question is, do you see a risk of Hungarization for Italy, a sort of democratic backsliding also for the Italian political system, or we shouldn't be worried, as also Davide said in his comment? This is the second question that I would like to put on the menu of our discussion. We can start again the round of speeches, and we can start with Filia again in alphabetical order. Filia?
Yep, thank you. So I have a couple of other points to try and tackle this area of EU and international politics and the implications that these new election results and this new political landscape is going to have. I would just like, as somebody who's interested in organized crime, just flag up how the mafia was not at all addressed during the electoral campaign at all, and it was a real lack of engagement with that. And also the fact, which could be quite concerning, that there are some politicians who might end up having some important roles in the Italian system who have been very close to people who've been condemned for mafia involvement. And therefore I think that that's something that we need to kind of bear in mind, that there are people who the mafia is still an element within the political landscape of Italy. It mustn't be forgotten. I think from my perspective, what I think the worry is from a kind of EU perspective, and perhaps also from an American perspective, is the idea that Italy was a founding member of the European Union, and now it is led by a group of Eurosceptics who are not interested in the European project as such, but interested in reaffirming their national identity and their national sovereignty. And therefore, one could ask whether there has been a kind of process of falling out of love with the European project. At the same time, I wonder whether the political leaders of Italy are also being very careful while having a certain rhetoric, as I've said before, the kind of very strong rhetoric of anti-EU policies, anti-EU collective identity or collective policies. At the same time, they have a clear example of what it means, you know, to pull a country out of Europe and the impact that it has on a society in terms of the economy, in terms of all levels of impact. I think that Britain and the UK and the way that Brexit is going is a clear advert to try and avoid that particular path. Yeah, it's not necessarily a fantastic success, and therefore leaving the European Union is not necessarily a great way forward. You know, you might be able to find some kind of compromise, and I think that, you know, the European leaders are always open to compromising and to finding solutions. It's just a shame that the British political elite weren't able to see or hear that. So I think the tension is really very much around this idea that, you know, how can a founding member of the European Union now turn its back on or distance itself from or not participate so willingly within the European project? And as has already been said, I think there has to be a level of kind of political acceptance that Italy needs the European Union's money at this particular point in time. So there's a delicate balancing act to play out. And I very much appreciated and liked the way that Silvia cut up the kind of domestic narrative, the domestic portrayal and the domestic face, and then the international face. And I think that that really is an interesting way of framing and understanding the threats as well. So the threat at the domestic level of underpinning or undermining human rights or basic rights of various communities and various minorities, but at the same time wanting to engage with international actors, wanting to talk to Biden, wanting to be respected and wanted to be taken seriously. I think that's really kind of an interesting way of looking at it. In terms of the challenges, clearly there are economic challenges, and I'm not an expert, so I don't want to necessarily underline that, but there are economic deadlines that are coming up very, very quickly. There are challenges at the European level, as have been pointed out. In particular, we've talked about the sanctions, the packet of sanctions against Russia, to understand how the alliance, how the governing alliance is going to deal with that, because there seems to be some kind of disagreement towards Russia and what the position is. And then obviously the kind of energy package. Within that, some of the commentators that I've been listening to have been trying to articulate clearly the position that Meloni can have vis-a-vis the Hungarian position. In other words, not necessarily join the Hungarian position, but perhaps try and be a mediator between Hungary and the other players like France and Germany. And therefore that would gain and give her more kind of political credence and political recognition, which is obviously, I think, what she's going to look for, because she's politically inexperienced at an international level. So there are opportunities for her to gain ground and to gain a certain amount of acceptance and a certain amount of legitimacy. The big thing that seems to me at the international level, which I think is the interesting one, and again, unpacking the rhetoric and how far she goes down the stance of trying to implement that, is obviously the supremacy of Italian law vis-a-vis European law. That clearly has been a kind of agenda of re-establishing, reaffirming the supremacy of national laws and trying to show that, you know, Italy first rather than Europe. And it'll be interesting to see whether she goes back there and reopens that, whereas the commentators that I've been coming across and listening saying, you know, it's non-negotiable, it's a historic fact, it's built into the constitution that this is the way that it has to be in order to guarantee peace going forward. And therefore it'll be interesting to see whether she wants to mess with that, or whether it was just an electoral kind of rhetoric, an electoral kind of promise, knowing that, you know, you don't really want to touch that because you might unpack some elements that you might not want to necessarily go reopen. So really, I think for me, it's the tension around the European Union and trying to gain legitimacy as a leader. Again, because these right-wing coalitions, a bit like the Le Pen team, haven't really had kind of substantive individuals who have experience. One of the things that might be problematic is that she might not have a good team of people who've got experience, of people who can engage with the European Union, and that's something that might be missing, that might not necessarily help. Just to sort of finish on the two specific questions that you pinpointed, Marco, I think her is going to be rather ironic that on the one hand, what will have given her victory will have been her distance from the Draghi technic government. What seems to be happening now is that the transition of power, she needs Draghi, and Draghi might be setting down certain conditions that she needs to respect in order for it to go smoothly, and in order for her to actually be able to make that transition work for her and her political coalition. So on the one hand, she's been very critical and it's won her power, but at the same time, it's from the outside, it would be helpful to have Draghi's safe pair of hands to guide her across to her kind of governing role. And if he was to say, no, I'm not going to help you, it would obviously be a much bumpier ride. So there's this kind of tension in a way that Draghi is key to her story. In terms of a Hungarian backsliding, I think it's an interesting one, and I think it explains why a lot of Europeans are very worried. But at the same time, I remember when Berlusconi came to power, and when Berlusconi started to try and cut down and limit, you know, trade union rights, there were a lot of people that went into the street. There were lots of protests. People weren't accepting that he wanted to curb certain trade union rights and certain rights that that were established in the Italian constitution. So I think that, you know, Italians, when they feel that their rights are being kind of curbed, and they feel that things, you know, politicians perhaps are taking liberties, I think that there will be a movement, there will be a backlash, there will be some kind of a response to that. So yes, I'm not sure I can predict what's going to happen. I'm also worried to a certain extent, but at the same time, I think that, you know, perhaps the institutions curtail certain changes. And at the same time, I think that, you know, if citizens see that there are certain basic human rights that are being impinged or taken away, then I think that, you know, the Italians will go down in the street like they did with Berlusconi. They showed Berlusconi that they weren't really accepting, you know, his vision of limited trade union rights. I hope that's given some kind of context to your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Filia. Catherine?
Yes, thank you very much. I guess a couple of points. I'll be relatively brief. I think what's interesting from the point of view of European politics and foreign policy is that there's a kind of double sigh. One's a sigh of relief, and one is, you know, a sharp intake of breath about what this may mean at the heart of Europe. On the one hand, there's a bit of a sigh of relief because Meloni's position has been pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin from the very beginning of the war. She is a close ally of Poland's Law and Justice Party. They're in the same group in the European Parliament. And therefore, I think that, you know, the alliance with Poland and the view with respect to Ukraine and to the actions of Russia mean that, you know, there is no deep worry that she's going to defect on those commitments. Also, she's a deeply committed Atlanticist, as is Poland, and specifically Law and Justice. And therefore, I think that here people are not hugely worried that she would support the Hungarian position, but rather that she will continue, they think that she will continue to support the Polish position. I think, on the other hand, you know, there is a sharp intake of breath, because what we could see is not just the Hungarianization of Italy, but actually, you know, a kind of an extended Hungarian kind of pact at the heart of Europe. And this is not people who want to leave Europe. These are people who want to stay in Europe, Poland, Hungary, Italy, but actually want to stay on different terms. And I think that, you know, the big danger here is now actually for the first time a kind of a potential a potential alliance, that has been stopped. Up until now, what we saw was their nationalism and their vanity, get in the way of any kind of functioning alliance. And we've always had this fragmentation inside the European Parliament. I think the CPAC, the fact that, the American conservative convention took place in Budapest. I think the fact that there are bridges being built between the American far right and a whole bunch of these different groups, a different kind of Atlanticism, if you like. This gives me cause to worry. I think that for the European Union, the presence in the EU's third largest economy, the presence of someone who will do, I think, everything that she can to stop the European reform agenda, means that even though she's going along with the European stance in favor of Ukraine and against Russia, I think that is a very specific case, and that in the rest of European affairs, she will be far more critical and will be far less constructive and far more uncooperative. Of course, she needs the 200 billion from the recovery package. This is why I think that she will probably take her time before really developing her full-fledged criticism actively as a member of the European Union. But we shouldn't forget that actually in less than 2 years we have European elections, and these European elections this time, could really be a watershed because there's strength in numbers, and I think Meloni does have her eye on this. And I do think that, as somebody who's studied the various intricate and fascinating shades of Italian populism, since the war. One of the things that I think we need to keep in mind is that if we compare Meloni to Berlusconi, I think we're in danger of overestimating Italian capacity for reactions. Berlusconi was not an ideologue. Berlusconi wanted to get things done, and things that stood in his way, like the unions, like certain laws, he would tackle, and he tackled them as a populist demagogue. And I think we should be a little bit more worried about Meloni, and particularly the resistance of institutions in the face of somebody like Meloni, who I think, wants to transform them slowly over time. She will not shy away from, I think, calling into question the rights of the media, for example, or the rights of the press. I think this is something that we should probably, expect if her government lasts. So I am far less sanguine about her. I think that she's deeply dangerous because she's more competent than the past few clowns that we've seen on the political right. But I think that she is an ideologue, and she will be moved by that within the limits of the practical necessities of a hard winter coming and Italy's economic needs. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Catherine. Silvia?
I entirely agree with what Catherine just said. I think differently from 2018, I think the big pressure point, the confrontation with Europe, will not come on the economics. So 2018 was an open defiance of fiscal rules at a time where fiscal rules were obviously not suspended like they are now, and it was coming on the back of two parties that had irreconcilable from a fiscal standpoint electoral platforms that came into a collision with almost equal weights, and then eventually the result was a bloated budget that was basically bringing together both those electoral platforms into a very expensive set of measures. I think this time is going to be different from that respect for two reasons. The first reason is one that I mentioned before. So internal balance of power within the coalition, I think, is going to allow Meloni to push forward her electoral platform at the expense of Lega's and Berlusconi's pledges during the electoral campaign, and this may contain the costs, so to speak, of the budget. But most importantly, anything that will be done on the fiscal side now is within the context of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan and the fact that money, the flow of funds from Next Generation EU, the Next Generation EU spending initiatives is, so to speak, constrained by sticking to the commitment that Italy has taken in that plan. And I think it is not in the interest of any government, even this government, to sort of give up those funds. And so for that reason, I think they will be careful in pushing the lines on the economics and on economic policy, on fiscal, and on the budget that we will see in October, November. Now, that said, I think there's also a more general reason, which is in 2018, I think that, let's say that the dominant message in the electoral campaign of both Lega and Five Star was paraphrasing, what has the EU ever done for us? And I think back then, it did resonate with a lot of people. It did resonate with the fact that Italy was a net contributor in the EU budget, but a lot of people not seeing very much how that translated in their own situation. So experiences very poor standard of living. Obviously, it's a country that has had zero growth for 20 years. And so from a socioeconomic standpoint, that's really started to weigh in, I think, at that time. That rhetoric is a lot less tenable now after COVID, because Italy is the biggest beneficiary of the EU spending initiative that was approved during COVID. And so in that sense, I think also anything that goes in that direction would not really play out very well with voters. And I think they won't go down that line. What I think will be more interesting to see, and what I think there's more risks, is also something that Catherine said, I think it will be in reconciling these two identities. So this very strong nationalistic identity and discourse that the party has pushed forward at the national level, with the permanence, obviously, of Italy in Europe, and the discourse that has been instead offered on the international level. So how those two things will be reconciled, it's not really clear to me, and I think we're going to see tensions there, probably not on the economic side, but more likely on positions, for example, support for any sanctions that were to be taken, or any let's say measure that were to be taken against Hungary. That is, I think, one obvious area where Meloni resolve to present herself as a credible partner in Europe will be tested, and probably will be tested soon. Not so much perhaps on sanctions against Russia or position in Ukraine. That seems to be very clear. I think it's been actually very consistent internally. Her position has been very consistent. The party has supported measures that were proposed by the Draghi government in this area, and so I wouldn't expect them to deviate. It's also consistent, internally consistent with their own, let's say, narrative, because it's a narrative of nationalism. What she's always been saying is, I am pro-NATO because NATO allows nation states to really be sovereign nation states. And so in that sense, I think it makes perfect logical sense for her to hold that position. On balance of powers and fundamental rights within the European Union, I think that is where probably ideological tensions will become evident pretty soon.
Thank you, Silvia. Davide.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief, because I mean, also other speakers have covered most of the key issues, including the fact that this is not the first government led by Eurosceptic parties. Just 4 years ago, we had the League and the Five Star Movement in government, and those two parties in 2018 were certainly more Eurosceptic than Brothers of Italy today, I think. And the Five Star Movement at that time was allied with Nigel Farage in the European Parliament. The League was already with Le Pen and other Eurosceptic parties. And both parties, shortly before going into government, had even advocated Italy's exit from the Eurozone. But having said that, it's clear that the European Union looks at Giorgia Meloni's rise with concern, because it could create further tensions and fractures within the Union. And I agree, I don't think so much in the economic sphere, but more in the area of rule of law, democracy, in a founding country of the European Union. And it is one thing to have Hungary led by Viktor Orban. Hungary is certainly an important member state, but relatively small. It is another thing to have the third most populous country and the third largest economy in Europe in a situation of, Marco, you said, democratic backsliding. This, I think, can have a paralyzing impact on the functioning of the European institutions, and can also create, and that was also mentioned, a contagion effect. So if Giorgia Meloni made it to the leadership of one of the main countries of the Union, it is hard to see why in the near future it could not be Marine Le Pen in France or Vox in Spain, for example. At the same time, Giorgia Meloni's position on Europe and also the Atlantic Alliance, I think is quite interesting. In Europe, and Catherine mentioned it, Giorgia Meloni is part of the group of European conservatives and reformists that was originally created by the British conservatives, and was once seen as a kind of group of more respectable conservative parties, which did not belong to the moderate European People's Party, but also refused to forge an alliance with other populist radical right parties. And that was also analyzed very well in a book by Duncan MacDonald and Annika Werner, published a couple of years ago. Today, of course, the British Conservative Party is no longer in the European Parliament, and in the European Conservatives and Reformists, we have the Polish Law and Justice, which was already there, but also we have Vox, we have the Sweden Democrats. So there has been a process of radicalization of this group, but it's interesting, I think, to note that Brothers of Italy is not in the same group with other important right-wing populist parties like the League, but also Le Pen's National Rally or the FPÖ in Austria. So, and this is my conclusion, I think this should prompt us to take a slightly more nuanced approach when looking at the relationship between the next Italian government and Europe. Certainly, we could observe a kind of, I would say, almost a triangulation in Italy's foreign relations with Europe on the one hand, the US and NATO on the other. Let's also see with what will happen in the US in 2 years. Catherine mentioned the European election, but in 2 years, there are also the presidential election in the US. And certainly a return of Trump or a Republican administration could create a new context that could be quite favorable for Brothers of Italy, which is very close to some sectors of the Republican right. Finally, on Ukraine, Giorgia Meloni has also been very consistent in her support for Ukraine. That's true and was highlighted by the other speakers. But also on the sanctions on Russia and sending weapons to Kyiv, even while being in opposition to the Draghi government. But I find it, and I think Silvia mentioned it also, I find it very interesting how Giorgia Meloni has distinguished herself from other populist right-wing leaders in framing her support to Ukraine as the defense of national sovereignty, which was violated by Russia. So Meloni, I think, has been very clever in using the concept of sovereignty that she often uses in her speeches to justify a position of support for the Draghi government's action in the area of foreign policy. So this also shows that Giorgia Meloni's actions are not fully inspired by pure ideological motivations, I don't think, but there is also an element of pragmatism, which I think is the skilled use of some ideological tools to justify positions that might not be perfectly in line with what her voters and core constituencies would expect. And this could emerge also in her relationship with Europe and the other international partners, I think. And I'm done.
Thank you, Davide. We have 7 or 8 questions. I don't know how to deal with these. If I have to read the questions and then you can reply to the question, probably I should read the question and then you will have 2 minutes for your answer. The first question is by Philip. On one hand, I hear that the Draghi government was very popular. On the other hand, I hear that one of Meloni's main selling proposition was that Fratelli d'Italia hadn't been part of Draghi's government. How does that fit together? The second question is, and Catherine probably want to address this question by Ebenezer. Since Meloni doesn't really have solid political experience and structures, what implication do you think that will have on her administration and achievement of electoral promises in Italy? Then we have the question coming from Nahla, the PD. The PD and the left are usually blamed for the result in terms of failing to forming an alliance that can counter the right to an extent. However, would the five-star movement have been able to attract the same vote share and it allied with the PD in terms of building its image and credibility? Then 2 questions coming from YouTube. Meloni is advocating for a stricter immigration policy in Italy. Immigration flow will continue and increase according to estimate. How would the EU position itself vis-a-vis a stronger stance from the Italian government vis-a-vis immigration quotas and immigration policies? Second question, one important point on the program is changing the constitution to opt for direct election of the president. How could that affect the relationship with the EU? Okay, last, again from YouTube, how do you explain the recurring pattern emerging where we see big turnover from a party to another, from a leader to another, along with a constant decline in voter turnout? So these are the questions. Again, we have 1.5 minutes for each speaker. Filia?
I think I'll let Catherine answer some of the questions that were directly, otherwise we haven't got enough time and I don't want to kind of waste time. So Catherine, I'll let you sort of answer some of the questions. I think it's more worthwhile.
Okay, I guess on the one that you pointed to me on the solid political experience and structures, I think it's true. This is something that's been brought up quite regularly about the fact she doesn't have the political staff, in a sense. She does have a close guard of allies, and she's already trying to slot them, in various positions. But I think that the more interesting thing that she's going to do is that she is going to appear as quite conciliatory by going around potentially and poaching where she can, highly technocratic personalities. This is going to be one of the paradoxes of this government, right? That it's in a way she has run on a populist ticket, really attacking, the technocracy of Draghi, the technocracy of Brussels, etc. But actually, what she's lining up herself for her own government is un governo tecnico, right? It's full of technocrats. And this is something that we've seen before, much earlier, potentially 100 years earlier in Italy, where there is a sense of appointing people who are industrial compatible and technocrats. So I think that this is how she's going to get out of this bind. She's going to simply look further afield, and it's going to make her look actually quite flexible and pragmatic and practical and reasonable. I just wanted to say one quick thing on another question here on the PD, and it's something that, just because we haven't really brought it up, and we talked about the way that the left in many European countries is having a very long moment of ideological transition that seems to not have a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. But one of the key things is that, whereas the Cinque Stelle actually they stood for universal basic income. They didn't have a lot of policies, but they were associated with that policy, which is why they did so well in the South. The PD, aside from everything else, did not have a program. It did not have policies. It had themes. And I think that it suffered from that a lot, that they just weren't able to put forward a program.
Can I just pick up on this one comment here?
Yes, Siva, we have 2 minutes and we have to
close. Yes, very quickly. On the question of, I think it was along the lines of, if everybody likes Draghi, then why did they vote for the party that whose main selling point was being against him? And I think that is a lot to do with what Catherine just said. So Italy is a country that has experienced a lot of technocratic governments, where technocratic governments actually command a very high trust and support among the people, as long as technocrats do not mingle with politics. And I think the experience of Monti in 2012 is exemplary of this. Now, Draghi didn't do that. He didn't mingle with politics. But I think what happened is something different, is that politics tried to appropriate entirely what they called the Draghi agenda. And that was effectively the only program that PD had. So it wasn't very much putting forward a platform of its own. It was putting forward the fact of not being the right, and the fact of continuing the agenda of a government that has preceded the election. And I think that was just not enough for people. So in the context of a political contest, that was not enough to win leadership. And Meloni was actually the second highest trusted politician, and political figure, institutional figure after Draghi in all the opinion surveys. And so I think it's only natural that it came out that this was the result that the elections delivered. And it helps somewhat explaining that mismatch.
Okay, Davide, if you want, you have 1 minute, less than 1 minute.
Yeah, no, I can just say, answer the question about whether if this 5-star movement had formed a coalition with the PD, perhaps it wouldn't have received the same number of votes. That's true. Probably the dynamic of the election would have been different, but at least I think this would have made the competition more balanced, and there might have, Letta kept saying there is this danger of a far-right government, we should stop it. So if it's so dangerous, why didn't he try his best to form a coalition against it? So I think that's why I think perhaps a coalition between the two parties would have helped. And about the Italian party system, that there are a lot of changes. There was a question about that. I think the current Italian party system is completely fluid, and there has been a process of the structuring of the system, and this is also linked to the personalization, the political personalization, the fact that it's so dominated by party leaders' personalities rather than party structure.
Can I just add, I was just about to say the same that you said, David, is the party is the kind of, the personal party seems to be also quite dominant, and we don't talk about it, but the personal party, Berlusconi, Meloni, these kind of, charismatic individuals who kind of, and in a way, the PD, it seemed as though it was more personal than actually ideological, and that in a way, because as you say, there wasn't a real competition. But we haven't talked about the personal party, which is very present in Italy and carries on being quite an important variable. But at the same time, I still think there's an element of partitocrazia in the way the parties control the lists, and therefore parachute individuals into places where they have no experience, and yet they're elected. But I think that, the lack of the coalition on the left can help explain why, we're all shocked by this right-wing victory, but they didn't even give themselves a chance by entering. And I think personalities got in the way, which is a shame.
Thank you, Filia. Let me thank all first of all, let me thank our great 4 speakers, all the everyone in the audience, also on behalf of the UI and also on behalf of the other organizer. Thank you for this great discussion. See you at the next seminar and roundtable. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.